Hi, everyone. It is a delight to see you all here. And hi, Melanie. I'm glad that you're here. We are extremely honored that today we have Kate Crawford joining us from Australia. And in her time zone, it's 7 a.m. So we had to do mic check at, 6:55. And that's and yes, she has a very huge cup of coffee with her. So we are very grateful that she made this time for us and she accommodated us on her Saturday morning. I just want to remind everyone, if it's your first time on the Salon, this is a weekly Salon where we gather to discuss with an interdisciplinary audience contentions and bridges between artificial and biological learning. And in the tradition of the 19th century salons, we are respectful, have a flat hierarchy, and have socially progressive norms. So if you are a person who usually doesn't ask questions, you can kind of feel more comfortable asking questions here in the Ask a Question area. And if you don't want to be seen on screen, you can say, ask for me, or you can allow people to vote for your question. And if it's a highly voted question, we ask you if you'd like to join the screen. If you have clarification questions, because no question is a bad question, this is an interdisciplinary forum, ask your questions in the chat area, and our colleagues will try to answer. And also, we are very privileged to have this weekly community because we think that discussing over long periods of times and with multiple disciplines is a different kind of skill than publishing, and we are hoping that we promote that idea here at the Salon. Okay, with that said, I am very excited to introduce Kate. For those of you who don't know Kate, Dr. Kate Crawford is a leading scholar of the social implications of artificial intelligence. She's a research professor at USC Annenberg, a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research NYC, and she currently holds the inaugural visiting chair for AI and justice at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Her academic research has been published in journals such as Nature, New Media and Society, Science, Technology and Human Value and Information, Communication and Society. Kate's work also includes collaborative projects and visual investigations, and her project Anatomy of AI System with Ladan Joler won the Beasley Design of the Year Award. And is in the permanent collection of the MoMA in New York. She also collaborated with the artist Trevor Paglen, am I pronouncing that correctly? To produce Excavating AI, which includes a 2-year study of ImageNet and other benchmark training sets, which won the Ayrton Prize from the British Society for the History of Science. Usually we don't do these long introductions, but I felt like for Kate, it's important to do that because she embodies everything we've discussed in the Salon, the interaction between art and sciences, the critical humanities look at sort of artificial intelligence and technologies, as well as one thing that she didn't mention there is that she's also a musician and she has amazing synthesizer music, and she can feel free to tell you what her name is on Spotify. And it's a fantastic pleasure to work with Kate. I learn a lot every time I talk to Kate, and I'm exceptionally inspired by the way that she can see the connections between very different types of topics and disciplines. And I particularly appreciate our joint fondness of nature, especially mushroom networks, and ways of thinking about learning that are a little bit more rhizomatic and more similar to the sort of mycelium, as opposed to centralized entities that assume and command dominion on Earth, like us. All right. With that said, Kate, please take it away. We are very excited to hear your talk.
Well, Ida, you just gave the most wonderful introduction, and you stole my line, which is that I absolutely have learned so much from working with you, and it's been such a pleasure. I just feel like the last few months of being in collaboration with you has been profound and has really changed my thinking on lots of topics. So that makes it all the more special to be here at the Learning Salon. So what I'm going to do is share a screen, and this, of course, is always the dramatic magic moment of will it actually work? So let's try. Let's try this little move here. And hopefully, any minute now, this will work for you.
Works great.
How's that? Beautiful. All right. Well, As I said, it is a particular honor to be here at the Learning Salon because I've just been really enjoying your sessions and this overlap in particular around AI, philosophy, and neuroscience. I should note that my background in terms of that Venn diagram is closer to the AI and philosophy end, with a lot of STS, history of science, and law in there as well. I want to begin just by saying that I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters, and culture, and I'm paying my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This is also a really special moment for me because I just launched a literally brand new, this new book called Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Costs of Artificial Intelligence. So what I'd like to do in a relatively short talk today, before we move to the really fun part, which is the discussion, is just give you a little bit of background about why I wrote this book and then share some of that new material with you. I want to start with the deceptively simple question, what is artificial intelligence? Well, if you type AI into Google image search right now, this is what you'll get. Blue tunnels of numbers, a couple of etched circuit boards, some white robots, and they're always white. You get ones and zeros, you get men in suits waving their hands in front of control panels. And I see this as a fairly problematic but very common framing of AI. It's abstract, ethereal, and immaterial. It is in some ways the ultimate view from nowhere. But if you ask somebody in the street what artificial intelligence is, they might mention Amazon's cloud service or Tesla's cars or Google's search algorithm. If you ask experts in deep learning, they might give you a technical response about how neural nets are organized into dozens of layers that receive labeled data and are assigned weights and thresholds. And that would be one definition. Another comes from one of the most popular textbooks on the subject by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig. I'm sure many of us are familiar with it, which states that AI is an intelligent agent that takes the best possible action in a situation. Now, each way of defining artificial intelligence is doing work. It's setting a frame, if you will, for how it will be understood and measured, valued, and governed. If AI is defined by consumer brands for corporate infrastructures, then marketing and advertising have effectively predetermined the horizon for us. If AI systems are seen as somehow more rational than any human expert, then I think that suggests that they should be trusted to make high-stakes decisions in domains like health and education and criminal justice. When algorithmic techniques are the sole focus, it suggests that only continual technical progress matters in this very narrow sense, with no consideration of the computational cost of those approaches or their far-reaching social and environmental impacts. In contrast, I argue that AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. Rather, artificial intelligence is both embodied and material. It's made from natural resources, energy, human labor, infrastructures, logistics, histories, and classifications. AI systems are not rational or really able to discern anything without computationally intensive training with large data sets or predefined rules and rewards. In fact, artificial intelligence as we know it depends entirely on a wider range of political and social structures. And due to the capital required to build AI at scale and the ways of seeing that it optimizes, AI systems are commonly designed to serve existing dominant interests. So in this sense, we can think of artificial intelligence as a registry of power. So in this book, I wanted to explore how AI is made in this wider sense. And this is why I use the concept of an atlas. Now, atlases obviously are very unusual books. You know, they allow you to turn the pages and to swap scales from looking at a continent or zooming into a city or a mountain range. And I think by using that metaphor, I want to leave this sort of nowhere of abstract algorithmic space to the specific somewheres where people and institutions make choices. But perhaps my favorite account of how a cartographic approach can be helpful comes from the physicist Ursula Franklin. And she writes that maps bridge this gap between the known and as yet unknown. And they become these testaments of collective knowledge and insight. So this book certainly owes a great deal to all of the scholars and the artists and the advocates that I've worked with over the years who've really helped shape my views. Some of whom I'll mention in this talk, but frankly, the list is far too long, so that's what acknowledgements in books are for. They're all in there. But to begin, I would just mention specifically the scholars Simone Brown, Wendy Chun, Alondra Nelson, and Lucy Suchman. So maps at their best offer us a compendium of open pathways, shared ways of knowing that can be mixed and combined to make these new interconnections. But there are also, of course, maps of domination, those national maps where you see the interventions of drawing borders across contested political space, to also looking at the historical paths of empires. By invoking an atlas, I'm suggesting that we need new ways to understand the empires of artificial intelligence. We need a theory of AI that accounts for the states and corporations that drive and dominate it, the extractive mining that leaves an imprint on the planet, and of course, the mass capture of data and the profoundly unequal and increasingly exploitative labor practices that sustain it. These are the shifting tectonics of power in AI. And I think a topographical approach offers us some different perspectives and scales. And of course, scale is a very important term, both in this book and in my work. And it allows us to go beyond just considering the latest machine learning approaches. And I think there's another way in which atlases are relevant here. The field of AI is explicitly attempting to capture the planet in a computationally legible form. This is not a metaphor so much as the industry's direct ambition. You can look obviously at the normalization of proprietary maps, the sort of centralized God's eye view of human movement, communication, and labor. And some AI scientists actually state their desire to capture the world entirety in terms of how we see it. Fei Li, for example, describes her ImageNet project as, and I quote, mapping out the entire world of objects. And Russell and Norvig, in fact, describe AI as, and I quote, relevant to any intellectual task. It is truly a universal field. One of the founders of AI, in fact, put it at the most extreme. This is Woody Bledsoe, and you might know him as one of the first ever people to really sort of experiment in the field of facial recognition. He wrote, in the long run, AI is the only science. Now, this sounds to me like a desire not just to create an atlas of the world, but to be the atlas, to create a dominant way of seeing. This colonizing impulse can be seen as centralizing power in the AI field, sort of determining how the world is measured and defined, while I think simultaneously denying that this is an inherently political activity. Like medieval Mappa Mundi, which is something that I've always been fascinated by. They illustrate religious and classical concepts as much as they do coordinates, like the one here. These are ultimately maps by the AI industry, which are political interventions, non-neutral reflections of the world. In contrast, my aim in this book is to go against the grain of colonial mapping logics and to embrace different stories, locations, and knowledge bases than the ones we commonly hear about in the colonialist pioneer narratives of AI. In other words, to conduct what the environmental geographer Samantha Saville calls a humble geography, a fundamentally different way of seeing artificial intelligence. Now, the precursor for me of doing Atlas of AI was this collaborative project that I did with Vladar and Jola that Ida just mentioned, where we studied and mapped the entire life cycle of a single Amazon Echo, from the minerals to the data processing to the device disposal in the ground. Now, that project was a much bigger research endeavor than either of us expected at the beginning, I'll be honest. And it required digging into these very disparate domains like supply chains, pay scales, smelting practices, the routes of container ships. And when we completed this project, I'd learned so much that what I wanted to do next was to expand this view of a single device, the Amazon Echo, to a much bigger scale, to consider ultimately the AI industry itself. And in doing that, what I've been discovering really is that we can think about artificial intelligence as the extractive industry of the 21st century that depends on exploiting energy and mineral resources from the planet, cheap labor, and data at scale. So that was a real motivation behind this 5-year project of writing Atlas of AI. So as a quick overview, I structure the book around 8 core chapters. It's effectively a stack analysis of artificial intelligence in this very wide sense. It starts from the bottom with the Earth, moving through labor, data, classification, affect, state, power, and space. And what I do in the book is to travel to the sites where AI is made, from its core mineral components to where we see human labor that's often hidden, such as in Amazon warehouses, to the laboratories where training data sets are made. And I even go to the rocket bases where current tech billionaires like Jeff Bezos are investing in a vision of departing the Earth altogether. So because the book begins at the Earth's crust, I thought I might just share a little of that chapter today. This is one of the places that I visited. It's the unincorporated community of Silver Peak in Nevada's Clayton Valley, where about 125 people live, depending how you count. Now, this is a mining town which is one of the oldest in Nevada, and it was almost abandoned in 1917 after the ground was stripped bare of silver and gold. And it wasn't until the 1950s that people realized that Silver Peak is in fact perched on the edge of a massive underground lake of lithium. Now, the valuable lithium brine under the surface is pumped out of the ground and left in these open, iridescent green ponds to evaporate. And it's the only operating lithium mine in the United States. And that makes this a site of intense interest to the tech industry for one big reason: rechargeable batteries. So here in this remote pocket of Nevada is a place where the stuff of AI is made. Lithium is known as grey gold in the trade. Smartphone batteries, for example, use about 7 grams of this material. The Amazon Echo has about double that. But each Tesla Model S electric car needs about 62 kilograms of lithium for its battery pack. Now, these kinds of batteries were never intended to supply a machine as power hungry as a car, but lithium batteries are currently the only mass market option we use. Now, all of these batteries have a limited lifespan. They are quite difficult to recycle and are commonly just discarded as waste. I was just reading a study that was published last month by the University of Augsburg, and they modeled 18 different scenarios of the known sites of lithium and how much we might have left to mine. In their most optimistic estimate, and that's assuming that we get much better at recycling, we are looking at depleting our reserves in around 2100. Without best practices, it could be gone by 2040. So this imminent shortage of critical minerals has now become an issue, and particularly in the US, you will have noticed that the Biden administration just released an executive order basically looking specifically at this problem of critical supply chains and the desperate need to research them and to find other forms of mineral extraction. Now, the Clayton Valley is connected to the Silicon Valley in much the same way that the 19th century goldfields were to San Francisco. The history of mining is, I think, commonly overlooked in these stories of technological progress. And as the historical geographer Gray Brecken points out, San Francisco was built from the gains of pulling gold and silver out of the lands of California and Nevada in the 1800s, when the land was stripped until the waterways were contaminated and many of the surrounding forests were destroyed. Since antiquity, we could really go back for hundreds of years. The business of mining has only been profitable because it does not have to account for its true costs, including environmental damage, the illness and death of miners, and the loss to the communities it displaces. In 1555, Georgius Agricola, known as the father of mineralogy, noted that it was clear to all that there was greater detriment from mining than the value of metals which it produces. In other words, those who profit from mining do so only because the costs must be sustained by others, those living and those not yet born. If we only price the extracted metals and not the negative externalities, then an easy calculus emerges: extract everything as rapidly as possible. So we could think of this as the sort of move fast and break things of an earlier era. Now, San Francisco drew enormous wealth from the mines, but it's easy to forget where it all came from. If you walk through the city streets, you do see these small reminders of the mines all around. In fact, the city's buildings were constructed using the same technology that came from deep within the Central Valley for transport and for life support. What I'm showing you here are diagrams from the report of the Geographical Exploration of the 40th Parallel, Volume 3 in 1870. The square set timbering method was used to extract ore, and the pulley systems that carried miners down into the mine shafts were then turned upside down to transport people in elevators to the top of the city's high rises. Now, Brecken suggests that we should think of the skyscrapers of San Francisco as inverted minescapes. The ores extracted from holes in the ground were sold to create stories in the air. And so now we see San Francisco being enriched once more, thanks to the extraction of white lithium crystal, vast amounts of data, and human labor all along the supply chain. In his book, A Geology of Media, the theorist Jussi Parikka suggests that we think of media not from Marshall McLuhan's point of view, in which media are extensions of the human senses, but rather as extensions of planet Earth. Computational media now participate in geological and climatological processes, from the transformation of the Earth's materials into infrastructures and devices. And of course, reflecting on media and technology as a geological process enables us to consider the radical depletion of non-renewable resources required to drive the technologies of the present. Each object in the extended network of an AI system, from network routers to batteries to data centers, is built using elements that required billions of years to form inside the Earth. From the perspective of deep time, we are extracting Earth's geological history to serve a split second of technological time, building devices like Androids and iPhones that have a limited lifespan of around 4.7 years. I just saw this horrifying statistic just this week, which is that of all of those consumer AI devices, which are ultimately being buried in e-waste dumping grounds, something of the order of 70% of all hazardous waste in landfills is now e-waste. I mean, that's kind of a staggering statistic. Now, much of that waste used to go to China, but when China banned e-waste because of its toxic legacy, it's now being sent to places like Thailand, Pakistan, and Ghana. And I think this is why we have to traverse far beyond the United States to see the legacies of human and environmental damage that have powered the tech industry. Now, there are many such sites, including the Salon in southwest Bolivia, the richest site of lithium in the world, and thus a site of ongoing political tension, as well as places in central Congo, Mongolia, Indonesia, and the Western Australian deserts. These are the other birthplaces of AI in this greater geography of industrial computation. So if minerals are the backbone of AI, its lifeblood is still electrical energy. The processing demands of training AI models, and thus their energy consumption, is still an emerging area of research. One of the early papers in this field came from Emma Strubel and her team at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2019. They were looking at the carbon footprint of essentially NLP models, and they began to sketch out potential estimates by running models over hundreds of thousands of computational hours. And Strubel's team found that running only a single NLP model produced more than 660,000 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions, or put another way, 125 round trips from New York to Beijing. And that's one model. Of course, the paper recently by Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, Margaret Mitchell, and Angela McMillan-Major, which was published in March this year, also pointed to the increasing environmental harms of large language models in ML, which doubly punishes marginalized communities that are the least likely to benefit from the progress achieved, and most likely to be harmed by the negative ecological consequences of resource consumption. This paper, of course, was embroiled in the much bigger scandal of Google firing both Timnit and Margaret. So as a way of bringing us to a conclusion so we can move to discussion, we might think of artificial intelligence as another kind of what the philosopher of technology, Lewis Mumford, calls a mega machine, an assemblage of technological approaches that depend on industrial infrastructures, supply chains, and human labor that stretch around the globe, but are primarily kept opaque. The fundamentally intertwined nature of production, manufacturing, and logistics reminds us that the minds that drive AI are everywhere, and they depend on what the philosophers Michael Hart and Antonio Negri refer to as the dual operation of abstraction and extraction in information capitalism. In other words, abstracting away the material conditions of their making while extracting more information and resources from those least able to resist. By persisting with descriptions of AI that are purely technical and abstract, I think has ethical consequences because it distances us from the energy, labor, and data needed to produce it, and the many kinds of mining that enable it. As the environmental philosopher Jess McLean has observed, we never do full cost-benefit analysis of our computational systems. Just before the pandemic hit, I actually made my last trip to Silver Peak. And as I was walking up in the hills, above the mind through the remnants of this ghost town, which is called Blair. Now, Blair was a thriving town in the early 1900s. Again, it was based around gold and silver mining, and hundreds of people moved there for work and for cheap housing. But of course, in doing gold and silver mining, you have to use a lot of cyanide for leaching, and ultimately the water became poisoned and the minerals were rapidly stripped. And by 1918, Blair was basically deserted. So it was all over within 12 years. And I was struck with the realization that Silver Peak itself might be a ghost town soon. Of course, I was looking down from Blair, and you can see the large lithium brine pits below. And we know that the current draw on that lithium has been very aggressive in response to the high demand, and nobody knows how long it will last. And one day, those lithium pools under the Clayton Valley will be gone, extracted for batteries that are destined for landfill, and Silver Peak will return to its previous life as a quiet place on the edge of an ancient salt lake, now drained. Thank you. I'm now going to hopefully end
this was amazing. Okay, this was so amazing. I kind of want you to talk more.
Yeah, I was thinking I'd like an 8-part documentary miniseries of you
I
speaking the
know.
entire time, like one for each chapter of the book.
If you're doing it, I'm in.
I'll talk to my people.
I would trust you. I would trust a Learning Salon produced documentary about these issues. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, our people will talk to your people.
Awesome. Claire, you're on it.
Hi, Claire. I kind of, before we start questions, I think I'm gonna try to, trick you into telling us a little bit more about chapters 5 and 6 also. I think chapter 5, which is on affect. So this is Kate's book, and I love the cover. I don't know if people can see the cover, but the cover is very thoughtful. And a lot of the things that Kate mentioned with regard to labor and everything are underneath. The minds and the labor are underneath so that brain can see a tree, which is also puppeted by above. So it's fantastic. It's just fantastic.
I have to say, this is again Vladan Jola, one of my favorite collaborators, and he did that illustration, but also many of the illustrations that start each chapter. And he's so thoughtful in looking at what are the kind of core intellectual arguments and how do you represent them visually, which is, I mean, frankly, it's a dark art. That's extremely hard to do. And he's just brilliant. So I'm glad you
it works beautifully, especially throughout your talk, every theme that you mentioned. And each of those images were also informed by images that we are familiar from, let's say, images associated with Antonio Negri's work, or with Foucaultian style of like the covers that we had from the Panopticon, and the images that are in there. So it was beautiful for me to see the aesthetic also. It's a very good, cohesive, fantastic illustration. In chapter 5, you talk about affect, and a lot of the people in this audience are adjacent to the field of psychology and have seen some of the sort of references that you're mentioning in this chapter. And in chapter 6, you talk about state, which I found particularly exciting. And you have your concluding chapter especially talks about power and justice, which is also quite fantastic. So I wonder whether you might have a little bit to tell us before we go into asking you questions, a little bit more about affect, state, and power.
Sure. I mean, I thought I was following the rules, Ida. You asked me to be short.
I know, but
so now I'm going to be longer. I apologize. But there's so.
How much? And by the way, just how much time do we have for questions?
Oh, good question.
Today?
1 hour. We have 1 hour.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just so that Kate gets to enjoy the questions.
I'm so looking forward to that. But let me talk a little bit about affect then, because I think you're exactly right that there's probably lots of people in this community who are studying what's called affective computing, or in the fields of machine learning, it's often called emotion recognition. So I have obviously been sort of tracking the systems on the technical side, which have been promising to do emotion recognition. You see them in airports, you see them in job interviews and hiring contexts. You're also starting to see them more and more in education, particularly during the pandemic, when we have students who are remote, and so they're used in things like proctoring software to see if people are cheating on their exams, or to, in some ways, alert teachers if people appear to be happy or sad or angry. And I kept seeing this collection of somewhere between 6 and 7 terms: happy, angry, sad, disgust, etc., and neutral. And I'm like, where does this sort of taxonomy of 6 or so emotions come from? And where is this idea that there are 6 universal emotions? Where would you even sort of prove such a theory? So I went back into the archives to read about one particular psychologist by the name of Paul Ekman, who's probably familiar to many people on this call. Now, Paul Ekman was very influenced by Sylvan Tompkins, the psychologist who was very premised on understanding affects as a system, the affective kind of system of human bodies. What Ekman drew from this was that it might be possible to find 6 universal emotions that we all feel and represent on our faces as a series of what he calls micro expressions. So what he did to prove this thesis, or at least to explore it, was to go to places like the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea, where he was trying to find isolated tribes. He encountered the Fjord people, and he wanted to show them essentially flashcards of people emoting, or at least faking emotions like happiness or surprise or sadness. And he would show these flashcards, trying to see if groups who had not been exposed to Western media would have a similar affective response, would at least understand that these represented the same emotions that they might have in happy situations or sad situations and so forth. Now, of course, Ekman had never done any research in cross-cultural communication. He hadn't worked with translators before. His first trip was, I think by his own admission, a failure. But he persisted with his line of inquiry and was funded by a truly phenomenal amount of money. I think in today's dollars, it's sort of over $20 million from the department, $20 million by the Department of Defense to pursue this work. And over the years, he began to automate this into what's called the FACS system for detecting facial expression. This has then been automated by a series of early AI scientists in the 1980s and 1990s. And now we see it in so many systems. But this fundamental question, are there 6 universal emotions, has been disputed from the very beginning. In fact, Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said this simply ignores so many factors around how we feel and emote, particularly in terms of how we show facial expressions. It's contextual, it's relational. And in many cases, any of us who've ever worked in the service industry or been told to smile for a photographer can tell you, for a matter of fact, just because you're smiling doesn't mean you're happy. So this one-for-one relationship, I think, is open to question. Now, the psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett in 2019 published the largest ever survey study of all of the literature that looks at the correlations between facial expression and internal emotional state. And she said there is no reliable correlation between these two things, and that she says fundamentally technology companies trying to do this are asking the wrong questions. It's a very, very profound and impactful study that's been widely cited, and I think now throws into dispute so many of these systems that are attempting to offer this sort of, if you will, almost sort of lie detector test to see what people are truly thinking and feeling. And just like the polygraph, I think we're going to find that a lot of these systems are deeply scientifically suspect. So I've done a sort of a deep dive into the research behind that in the book. That's the shortest version I can give you, Ida. I hope that gives you a sense of the arc of that work.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. There are a lot of attendees that have either studied psychology or are students. And I think a lot of us know Lisa Feldman Barrett, and people can also check Lisa's work and their book. Oh, thank you, Ryan, for putting the book there. All right. With that, I think we will go into questions. And John, would you like to be the first?
I always love it when you ask me that. Kate, I'm in the interest of time. First of all, we're having these really uncannily amazing sessions on the Learning Salon. I mean, they've all been great, but we had an amazing one last week. And listening to you, And you really should have a series, a documentary series, and it should be done. And I mean that, actually. There's a kind of, I don't know if you're a Roberto Bolaño fan, but as I was listening to you, I was thinking about his book 2666 and how he talks about these hinterlands of despair and subjugation and untold stories that are underneath, if you look carefully, the shine of the abstract thing that we should be excited about, right? And I think what you managed to do in a very short period of time is to convey that haunting truth with all its texture that goes missing, right? And I haven't read your book. I mean, I have it. I'm going to. But one thing that I noticed about it, I was wondering. It reminded me a bit. It echoed a little bit. And tell me if I'm getting this wrong. James Bridle's book, New Dark Age, where he also talks about this ideology of information, automation, technology, domination. That seems to be so objective, but is utterly saturated with the same old exploitation and ideology that has always been with us, right? And I mean, I'm not sure if you've read it, but I think New Dark Age is just, you probably have, right? But am I wrong? Just, I'll ask my next question, that there's a certain shared sense of doom and portent if you look closely at these techno fads, but underneath, it's doom and darkness. Would you and that we've got to be super careful about what we're doing to the planet?
Yes.
Would you agree that that's the kind of world we should be taking a very sharp look at?
Well, I absolutely agree that there's a resonance between The New Dark Age by James Bridle and Atlas of AI. In interesting ways, and also there are some points of difference. The book, for those who haven't read it, I think is an absolute tour de force of how we might start looking at these thematics of forms of late modern technology and what they actually do in terms of how they shift the way we live and shift the planet. And in fact, James Bridle was the person who broke the story about YouTube actually having this bizarre underworld of content that was produced to spike recommendation algorithms to say, oh, this is very similar to Peppa Pig, almost always in sort of children's videos, but actually would have these increasingly disturbing videos that had sort of violence and horror contained within them, but that were constantly on auto replay on YouTube. So there was go down these tubes of increasing horror, which was an extraordinary investigation. And what's different, I think, is that Atlas of AI is really focusing on the histories of artificial intelligence specifically as a field and machine learning in particular. And it does that by going both through those production histories in terms of its supply chains in basically what it draws from the earth, what it draws from labor, and what it draws from data, but also looking at those ideological threads. What do we assume we are mapping when we create machine learning models? What do we assume we're doing when we create large-scale training sets? So in that sense, it's a difference in focus. But what James and I share, I think, is a real concern about what these ideological and political frameworks are actually smuggling in with them. What are we accepting as these frameworks when we adopt and deploy these sorts of approaches? In terms of doom, though, I would just say this. The book, for me, ends on, I think, an optimistic note, which is that if you look at so many of the civil rights organizations and the NGOs who are working on issues of climate justice, labor rights, data protections, they are all now starting to center on these questions of centralized technological systems. In some ways, we're seeing almost an immune response from a wide range of social actors who are saying, we actually have to do this differently. This is raising very real threats to the planet and to the societies that we live in. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that we're seeing a response now, which perhaps is another point of difference. But
yeah, and you know, I guess I was also thinking about, you know, when you showed that picture of the lithium lakes and then, you know, this idea that when we're looking at our screens, we don't really realize that there are these Mordor-like server farms beginning to dot the world, right? And also the point that AI, through everything you're describing, could actually make the world so unpredictable, climate change and other such things, it actually defeats its own algorithms. It's actually, I mean, one of the interesting things I think also made is that it started with wanting to predict the weather, and here you are creating a world that's increasingly chaotic, you know, with tornadoes and floods, and that we're actually making the world too hard for our algorithms, in a sort of delicious irony. Do you think that's metaphorical or potentially true?
I mean, I think it's literal. I mean, you just look at, in fact, I speak, in fact, it was just this week speaking to climate scientists who are increasingly horrified that in order to do the modeling they need to do of the profound and rapid changes that we're experiencing on the planet, they need to use ever larger models, which burns ever more carbon, which actually contributes to this weird sort of
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But again, you know, the question it always gets down to, we don't value what we don't measure. So if we're not measuring the costs of running huge, large-scale models, if we don't measure what it is to actually, you know, create systems that rely on very low-paid labor throughout the supply chains of, say, labeling, training data sets, crowd work, etc. If we don't look at the sort of costs of these systems, then of course we won't factor them in. And so this idea of negative externalities is sort of throughout the way we see the history of artificial intelligence developing. So I think you're absolutely right that we're almost living the consequences of some of those already.
Yeah, and then the point you made about Ekman, you know, there was I had a kind of moment of sort of uneasiness when I was listening to you, and there were emojis flowing down the right-hand side of the text box, and it made me realize that, in a sense, the universality of the emojis is making exactly the assumption that Margaret Mead was questioning, that you were talking about. So in other words, you know, there was always that joke that's been around a long time that Freud might have been wrong, but we're all Freudians now, right?
Yeah.
Do you, in a way, are these emojis telling us what our emotional expressions should be? In other words, are we sort of almost being trained into a certain homogeneous emotional expression range by this? In other words, is it going to undermine the very insight that you actually finished with? That it worries me.
Well, I mean, you know, some people might think this is a lighthearted question, but I think a lot about emojis. And in fact, several years ago now, 5 years ago now, I wrote one of the first academic articles on emojis with the amazing Luke Stark, who has been also doing some really important research around the politics of facial recognition. But we wrote this paper looking at what we call the conservatism of emojis, that it has this tendency to say, here are the sort of range of emotions that can be conveyed. What about the things that don't fit the emoji paradigm? What things tend to fall away? What forms of emotional expression become so strange and archaic because they don't fit within the sort of modes of emojidom? I say that also at the same time as somebody who embraces emojis and sort of loves what they offer us as shorthands, but I do think about the way in which we are standardizing forms of human expression. And that is something that we're seeing not just as emojis as an input device, but as outputs, as the way in which things that we're doing right now in these little Brady Bunch boxes are being analyzed as us emoting and coming up with expressions that are fitting into one of 6 little boxes. So I'm concerned about that on both the input and the output side.
Yeah, and then my last question to sort of try and get a grounding on this Bolaño-like sort of post-industrial, post-AI despair, you know, which we shouldn't get. I know you're saying we should be optimistic, but you mentioned something, you didn't say hyper-object, but I'm familiar with this notion of a hyper-object, something that's so complex
Absolutely.
that it's very difficult to get traction on it cognitively as a human. And I always wonder whether the notion of the hyper-object makes it very difficult to do local intervention. It's like in Monty Python, right? That one joke that's so deadly that no one can know the whole joke, right? And I was wondering, that are we dealing here with a hyper object that makes it difficult to fight it, or do you think the only way to fight it is by these local incursions that you're talking about? Are we up against something too big?
I love this question because you're really cutting to the heart of the problem. And when Morton uses this idea of the hyperobject, I see it very much as a continuation of Mumford's mega machine. It really is the same idea, but large over.
That's right. Mega machine is what you said. Right,
I used mega machine, but you know, Morton's hyperobject is you know, very related, I think. And you can draw a line between, you know, when Mumford was writing about the mega machine, he was thinking about the Manhattan Project. He was thinking about projects that were so large and had, you know, thousands of scientists working without being aware of really what they're working on in some cases, and certainly not being aware of each other. So it was this idea of a machine that was so vast that its components were not even aware of the machine that they were participating in.
Yes.
When we see this intellectual trajectory towards the idea of the hyperobject, you're now starting to look at systems that are both human and non-human. You might think about sort of climate change as a hyperobject, as something that, you know, incorporates so many systems, many of which we can see, many of which are completely opaque to us, but which we are participating in, whether or not we recognize that we're part of that. And certainly, I think artificial intelligence is in that category. But this idea of how we respond, I think, is the most important question. And I would reject this idea that we can't do anything. At the same time, this is not, I want to be super clear, this is not a consumer choice story. This is not a story of choose the more ethical AI. This cuts to a fundamental collective action problem of how we're actually going to draw boundaries around these systems, what we're going to allow and what we aren't going to allow. And traditionally, that's been done by governments. It's been done by regulation, which is why, of course, regulation is so overdue in this space. But it's also done by collective politics and collective politics of refusal. When we actually say, no, we actually don't want to have facial recognition in this neighborhood. We've seen that now in Somerville, in Oakland, in so many sort of small, as you say, sort of local instantiations. How do we think about scale and protest? How do we think about scale and refusal? That's where I see your question really pointing to what for me is an ongoing set of questions. And actually, I'm currently doing a research project with Michael Madow at MSR and Mike Anany at USC, looking at just that question, because I think it's hard to think about how do protest movements or even just forms of refusal scale against hyperobjects.
Right. How do we turn the refusal itself, fight a hyperobject with another hyperobject, right? In other words, something like, fight structure with structure, something like that. Well, look, I'm going to stop there, but just it's really, really fascinating, and thank you very much. And you know, we really will have to have you back. All right, thanks a lot. Okay.
When the world reopens and Kate is back in New York, John, we need to get you to New York so we can all have like a nice, long conversation.
Love it.
Jova, do you want to go next?
Sure. So, Kate, thanks. That was really fun and interesting for me. So your book, as I was reading it, I was reminded of a few other books. As someone previously mentioned, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. You know, but I think your book touched me in a way that's very different than that book. I mean, Silent Spring, to be fair, I read it when I was 10. So, you know, I had different priorities perhaps, but I'm not daily putting pesticides down on the earth. That's just not something I was doing when I was 10, and it's not something I do now, and I don't ever plan to. And so the kind of the take-home message for that was easy. Like, okay, I'll buy local organic groceries, and I won't contribute to that problem, and I'll vote for people who support that. And then I read Rachel Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? And she introduces this concept of the prison industrial complex. And what you were saying really reminded me of that. There's like an AI industrial complex. And you know, that I don't put people in jail. And I vote for people who argue that we should do that less. But the AI thing, like, I'm talking to you now on my Apple computer. Like, when I bought your book, I saw the thing on your website that said buy from the hegemonic bookstore or the local one, but I wanted a digital copy so I could read it at night next to my kids while they're sleeping without waking them up and going to get a book or whatever. I'm actively participating in this thing, and I'm funded by it. Microsoft funds me, DARPA funds me. I feel like a huge hypocrite if and I'm okay with that. I've been a hypocrite before, but are you saying we're all being super hypocritical right now? And like, what should we do? Like, what do I do? I can't not use my computer anymore. Realistically, it's my job. Or maybe you say I need a new job.
Well, I feel like we'd be having a very different learning salon if we're like, right, let's completely all change our lines of work. I mean, that would be interesting. But again, I want to save you from going down the individual consumer choice path. There's so much that you can do with the power that you have through those precise funding channels of tech companies and defense. These are spaces where, honestly, we're looking at much bigger forces at work, that your role as a participant in a democracy is actually just as, if not more important, in terms of how you're actually going to draw legal and regulatory lines around these sorts of problems. But for me, I think, again, about the forms of power that we do have, particularly those of us who are designing technical systems. Now, I was just recently speaking to a person who's responsible for building a huge cloud architecture for a large technology company outside of the US. And to me, what was so fascinating was that I was asking the question of, how much energy does this draw down? Like, tell me what the sort of, per wattage cost. And they're like, well, we can kind of we have some figures around that, but realistically, we don't have an idea of what the cost of compute is in any kind of way. And we certainly don't try to surface that to our customers. What is the cost of that? What is the cost of the moment that we don't understand what the cost is of saying, oh, we want to create another training set to try and delineate a particular cat from another type of cat? Even though that training set might exist, we're going to create another one. We're going to now do one that does another type of data gathering that, again, is hugely intensive. And here, again, I would point us to things like LLMs and sort of large-scale models, which are pushing an era of what we could think of as AI supercompute. Rather than sort of trying to find more efficient ways computationally of doing what we're doing, we're going to even more energy-intensive ways that involve so much more of the sorts of problems that I'm raising in this book. And that's even without talking about things like Bitcoins and NFTs. I'm sure you all saw the recent quote by David Wallace Wells, where he said that just looking at Bitcoin alone, just the number of Bitcoins that have been mined to date, has used the equivalent of all of the energy that has ever been produced by solar panels. So we have just wiped out those changes by the creation of essentially types of blockchain currency. So who's doing those metrics? Who's looking at those decisions that we're making? And when those decisions are essentially deracinated and removed from their consequences, then, of course, we should just create more coins, or we should all be doing NFTs and not think about the costs. So really what I'm trying to do here is to give us a different framework. So rather than saying, throw everything away, the Luddite vision, this is actually something more about saying, how are you making choices? And are we getting sufficient information to actually make those choices? And do we need collective change? And I'd say the answer to that is yes.
That's a great answer. So it kind of reminds me, I don't know, you remember David McCalley wrote this book, it was called Into Hot Air, about, in the UK, what the relative energy costs were, and whether it would even be possible to have sustainable energy in the UK, and what would be required. I feel like that's kind of what you're saying we need now for AI. Like, what would it take in order for AI to be carbon neutral, for example, without companies just buying carbon offsets, which is the way they're doing it now, but actually not burning all those fuels and not doing the exploitative labor practices. And it's not at all clear that there's a vision for how to achieve that even.
Right. And I think we need that vision. I love your references here. And I think all of those books, Silent Spring absolutely transformed me as a child as well. And similarly, kind of the deep realizations of so many researchers who pointed us to things like the prison industrial complex. I think they have had an enormous impact. Rachel Carson did change what was happening in terms of the way that we were using DDT and multiple other chemicals in intensive agricultural processes. Not everywhere, but certainly that book was profoundly impactful. We have a long way to go with the prison industrial complex, but we have extraordinary numbers of activists who are working on that all the time. We don't necessarily have the same groups that we can point to yet around artificial intelligence and how we think about these broader costs. And that's something that I think we're going to need, because again, I do believe that this is a fundamentally political question, which means that we actually have limited time. We have limited time because of the speed with which we're seeing both environmental change and labor exploitation and the shift of the AI industry to actually do these problems and in an exponential way. They're actually sort of scaling up. All of the things that I write about in this book have only become more intense since the pandemic, and certainly even just in the last few months. So that's the time pressure that I see, and why I think these conversations are increasingly urgent.
Well, I look forward to you leading us in that vision.
I'm loving these questions, by the way. A fantastic, really good discussion in the chat.
I'm learning so much from you. This is fantastic. And I really appreciate the resonance that this has with the question that actually Jovo mentioned as well. Is something that I've told you before, that sometimes when we have a conversation, I'm like, but the other work that I'm doing, I am training big model, not as big as NLP, but there is a sense of cognitive dissonance that happens sometimes between bigger picture philosophical considerations of the impact of one's work in the world, and between the work that one joyfully and with a childish, I guess, appetite approaches. And I'm building a model of memory, and now I think about this artwork and this paper, and then I build this model, I add this thing. My model can now navigate in a game. But then you think, then the kind of the other side, which is, what are you really doing on this earth? What else are you doing? It's kind of a difficult position to be in, and I agree with Jovo. And I wonder, what do you think about modeling cognition in general? Because that's something that a lot of us are, we are kind of giving a lot of effort out of. The last big session that John was mentioning was a session about this book, actually, Curiosity and Power. So out of sheer curiosity, there is this joy in exploring what the mind does, how the brain enables all of the cognitive functions of the mind. How can we model it to understand, just that sense of understanding, but also how can we then design the kinds of AI that can assist in mental illness, etc. But then how are those mental illnesses defined, and what are the conditions that give rise to those mental illnesses? There is kind of the part where one approaches, or at least I approach, with a sense of joyous appetite and curiosity, and then there is the part that is of course the kind of the toxic AI culture in general. But then there is, on the top of that, this considerations of what kind of culture am I contributing to. Where do you think there is a value in measuring and modeling cognition? And it's totally okay if your answer is no. I'm totally okay with that. I just would really love to hear your thoughts on that. Basically, I'm selfishly, on behalf of myself and a lot of others who might have similar thoughts in the audience, I'm wondering if you could think with us. What would be a way that we could continue this path? Although I have to admit that the kinds of models that we build in understanding cognition are way less costly in general. We don't use as much compute powers as BERT, but with the pressure of the industry research labs, including what I'm doing, competing with academia for the same kind of submissions, the same kinds of journals, same resources sometimes. I mean, not the resources at least, but competing for the same kind of mindscape of what the zeitgeist of science is at this time, I have this worry that it's going to push the kind of the curious minds of academia also towards these bigger models and sort of more costly ones. Where do you think is that line of this kind of modeling cognition, computational models that we're building to understand brains, the ambitions of those brain projects versus how much of a cost does it have, and how much faster are we destroying our ability to inhabit the Earth?
I love this, and as always with our conversations, Ida, I'm just taking reams of notes. And I want to try and answer that in two different ways. One is a very pragmatic response, and one is a more epistemological response around, how we contribute to knowledge. And certainly at a pragmatic level, I'm thinking here of, you're too young to remember this, but like 25 years ago, if you were in an industrial research lab, you had a curiosity. You're like, I want to try and sort of see if I can create this piece of software. You had to work within very specific, precise parameters of how much compute you had. And so, for companies like Microsoft, for example, you've got generations of engineers who used to tell these stories about having to sit around in conference rooms going, well, we just don't have the capacity to build something that big, or you've only got, this much space on a floppy disk, so this is what you're going to have to work with. And so there was a very real resource constraint in terms of just how much you could do given the compute that you had. And what happened, I think, in the last 12 years is that we got very lazy. We saw, again, with Moore's law being what it is, just the capacity for cheaper and cheaper compute to allow more people to do bigger things all the time. And what you see is that every time the capacity for compute increased, we filled it. Every time we had more speed to do more things, we would do them. So it's not as though we maintained that efficiency, we actually became lazier. And many computer scientists have made this observation. So I'm certainly not new in adding to that. But what I would say is that by letting go of that idea of constraint, of working within constraints around computation, that laziness has produced, I think, a type of, again, move fast and break things for modeling, which is just, do all the things, get all the data, throw it up against a wall and see what you get. And that unfortunately comes at a real cost, but it's a cost that you don't see. So for as long as you don't see that, I think we've actually generated a very unequal ground for doing good science. And it can ultimately produce just, I think, bad science, which is that we're not actually questioning those hypotheses before just like generating a big model and seeing what we can do. So that's the first thing I would say. But at a deeper epistemological level to your question, we have always modeled cognition. That's something that we have done forever. You can go back to Aristotle, you can see what the Greeks did. This is something that we have a very deep bench on. That will always continue. The question here is, are we modeling it in ways that are effectively giving us better or deeper answers about cognition? Is the fact that GPT-3 has 175 billion hyperparameters actually producing a conversational agent that's that much better than Eliza? And if so, why is it actually that computationally intensive and that capital intensive, where it's costing $1 billion a year? That's just a gigantic commitment that you'd really want to see, that we were producing something that was worth it. And who's asking those questions? Like, what is the kind of calculus of value here that we've sort of allowed to drop away in what I think is this sort of ideology of innovation? It's new, therefore it's great. And I think we just have to be a lot more skeptical about what these systems are promising to do and what they cost us in return. So, at the root of your question is, should we still be modeling cognition? Absolutely. Are there enormous, fascinating research questions there? Yes. Does it mean that we need ever larger models in this sort of AI supercompute model? I don't believe so. I'm yet to see evidence that is producing science that we couldn't have had in other ways.
I'm very glad you said that. So first of all, as Melanie Mitchell, who's in the audience, I hope that we can have her on screen soon, would agree. We don't think GPT-3 is a model of cognition. It's basically mostly kind of a product. Another thing that I wanted to say is I really appreciate what you said. Something that was bothering me, I guess, 2 sessions ago, where there was this discussion of what we need to do is just build bigger models. And I kept just shaking my head and disagreeing the whole time. Part of the thing that I was thinking was that the environmental cost alone of non-hypothesis driven, just making bigger models, just slapping more and more number of deep layers, just to get a slight improvement over something that was done before is, in my opinion, harmful. So I don't just disagree with it scientifically. I think scientifically it's not a good approach to begin with, but it's also, not only is it not good science in my opinion, but it's also harmful. And it's not disrespecting any person, so it's acceptable in the constraints of the salon to disagree with the approach. I do think that approach is scientifically not great, and also it's harmful. And unfortunately, some people are advocating for it. Some people are saying, oh, let's just make bigger models. It's like, no, but let's see. Don't you want to see how the brain works so make it efficient like the brain? In fact, there was a very interesting talk recently at Microsoft Research where so many of these deep layers, in fact, are not necessary to get the outcome that you have. Because at the end of the day, if you see what's been learned, it's not using so much. And a lot of the work that this particular grad student at MIT was doing was completely focused on, okay, how can we reduce this? How can we reduce it from the beginning? Because that's what they were trying to work on. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to, we only have 20 minutes left. I'm going to, I guess, switch to, John, seems like you wanted to say something. And
no, I just wanted to say, I mean, it was extremely refreshing. I mean, I agree that, and I hate to say this, but I couldn't help thinking about GPT-3 and the giant amount of money and energy used. It just made me think of this new documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes, that's just come out by Raoul Peck, and which is just remarkable. I can't recommend it enough. Where there's just this hubristic desire to conquer that claims to be doing it just for the sake of discovery, but doesn't seem to mind what it tramples over in while it does it. And I completely agree with you. There's just something about it that just feels that way, and we need to take a step back, and I find that very refreshing. Anyway, that was a bit extreme, but I couldn't help saying it. Who's up next? Yeah.
I'll definitely watch that. And I'm also just noticing these fantastic comments in the chat about, I'm just agreeing with Claire, who just wrote that she's gone to so many machine learning talks where the answer to your model, if it doesn't perform well, is just make it deeper. And it's really common, and it's become really the dominant approach, I would say, just in the last 6 or 7 years, that it's become almost a sort of this size contest of like, well, just throw more layers at it, and the more compute for these tiny incremental improvements. And I think we're getting to a point now where people are starting to ask much harder questions of that, and you are starting to see different approaches, zero-shot learning, etc., attempts to try and create efficiencies there, because we've got that very lazy approach. So yeah, I just wanted to agree with everything that you're saying, Ida, and it's something that we see a lot of. Hi,
Melanie.
Great to see you, Melanie.
Melanie, you're muted.
Hello. Hey, good to see you, Kate. Thank you so much for this talk. It's fantastic. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm definitely planning to. I think you sort of already, you and Ida already kind of addressed my question, which was really about AI. The kind of AI you're talking about is really this sort of big data AI. Big neural networks, big data, large language models, etc., which is a little bit of tarring the whole field with one brush, I think, because it's, maybe most people work on big data kinds of things, but more and more, I think people are trying to work on how do we do more with a small amount of data. And I think a lot of people see that as kind of the next frontier in the field. So I'm wondering if you see that there's more kind of systemic problems with the field than just this sort of environmental big data problem, or if there's sort of a better future with more kind of smaller data, but more maybe learning more about how the sort of really fundamental ideas of what intelligence is. I'll stop there.
I mean, that's great. And I guess, it is totally fair enough to say not all AI and as a response to this. And what I would say is, I am looking at the largest industrial formulations of AI. I'm looking really at the largest 10 companies that are doing this at scale, who are really doing sort of planetary scale AI. And at the moment, they're not using sort of these newer, more efficient, trimmed down models. They're not spending huge amounts of resources into like zero-shot learning or sort of different ways of looking at these approaches. And in fact, what we are seeing them do is go the other way, which is to sort of, create ever larger sort of collections of these sort of, again, sort of primarily training database models and sort of massive hyperparameter models. So you're absolutely right that there are people now who are saying this is a big question and we need to do more research in it, but it's very emergent. And I think what we're looking at is an industrial formulation that has become extremely powerful in the last decade and is actually running these large-scale systems. So that's really my focus in sort of looking at what that shift has brought us scientifically, culturally, and ecologically, in the hope that people who are doing that research now will actually be empowered to do more with that, to actually further the work that will create far more computationally efficient methods. Because you're absolutely right, we could have them. There are ways of doing it. And those ideas have actually been around for quite a while, but they haven't been the horses that people are betting on. So we have to ask why, and how do we actually shift those dynamics to produce much better systems that have this broader framework of how do we think about the legacy that we're leaving in creating these systems now. But it's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the people I know who work in AI, even at big companies like Google or Facebook and so on, are really convinced that the big data supervised learning is just a dead end. And but I guess the message hasn't made it all the way to the top there. And even unsupervised learning, like, or self-supervised learning, is a new thing now that still requires a huge amount of data. And we find that I think that's going to end up being a dead end. Also, that's my opinion. But it's hard to, I guess it's hard to change things when there's a huge momentum behind it.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. And it's that question of industrial momentum. And I also know lots of research scientists inside Facebook and Google who I have those conversations with. But I look at what Facebook and Google are doing, and it is absolutely the opposite. It is this race to ever larger models and sort of larger compute. I mean, just the compute infrastructure alone is mind-boggling. If you just look at sort of the land acquisitions and the water and the energy, again, even trying to do the research to get those numbers is one of the hardest things I've had to do as a social scientist and as a researcher, to actually trace it, because these are some of the most guarded corporate secrets. For all of the obvious reasons, that these are quite horrific costs. And I noticed that Alex, in the chat, was talking about the fact that this big models obsession and race has to do with a lot of big firms having joined the deep learning research game. And it is now to their competitive advantage because they have pipelines of enormous amounts of data every second. And so they're using that advantage. It's to make highly efficient models that anyone could use without having a huge pipeline of data every minute would actually mean that they would have more competition. So you can also see some economic reasons why we've reached the particular point that we're at now.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Hi, Benjamin. This is a couple of weeks we haven't managed to get to your question, so I'm glad that you're on screen now.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and thanks for that talk. That was really, really interesting. I guess my question was just about, you brought up all these ways that AI has all these negative environmental impacts, and it just got me thinking about whether, what the flip side of that would be in terms of cases where AI could, do something to benefit environmental causes. And I don't know a ton about this, but I'm just wondering, how you factor that into this analysis. I guess one example that I have is I have a friend that works at a company that, as far as I understand it, basically the whole point of this company is to reduce the number of 18-wheeler trucks that are driving all the way across the country that are completely empty, because apparently some huge percentage of those are just going from one destination to another, waiting to pick up cargo. And so by doing some, predictions and optimizations. I guess they're trying to cut down on that, which seems like, a great way of, saving carbon emissions or whatever you so yeah, I'm just wondering how you factor potential things like that into these sort of cost benefit analyses.
Great. I mean, certainly if I look at the big challenges we're going to face on this planet in the next 50 to 100 years, we're going to need sensing systems that are planetary wide. We're going to need as much information as we can get, and we're going to need to have ways to understand what to do in response. And of course, a lot of those questions are not just scientific, they're political, and we'll need political will to make them actually happen. But to bench that for 1 minute and just to talk about the piece that you're referring to, I'm very optimistic that we can create systems that will be able to actually really help us get better information and better analysis to address those sorts of challenges. The trucking one is a good example, though, for showing how we can get this wrong. So I would point you to the extraordinary work that's done by Karen Levy at Cornell, studying truckers and the shift to sort of increased automation in the trucking industry. Now, what we could have done is just, run models to look at how could we create sort of more efficient, essentially transport routes, almost like a traveling salesman problem of what do you do with all of these kind of empty trucks kind of moving around the country. But what has happened far more often, where the far greater investment has been in essentially kind of surveilling truck drivers, in sort of creating these sorts of systems that are constantly looking at their facial expressions and their emotions while they're driving on the road, despite the fact that, as we've talked about, so many of those models of emotion and detection are fundamentally flawed. What we've seen is kind of ways to try and automate labor and to extract more out of the few bodies that are still sort of left in the system. So here again, we have to sort of go up a level of analysis and say, what problems are we trying to solve, and with which tools? Are they the right tools to solve these problems? So for me, that really cuts to what are the cultures of science that we're promoting, and how do we ask those questions in ways that are really sensitive to these social, political, and ecological factors.
Cool. Thank you.
Just to sort of follow up quickly on that point, it seems to me, Kate, what you're saying in a way is what you don't want to do is, in the guise of helping with the technology that you want to promote, actually perpetuate the very same problem by seemingly helping, but actually you're not. You're just actually, in the end, making the problem worse, right? In other words, you've got to be very, very aware. Otherwise, the ideology is just slinking in yet again in a seemingly helpful guise, but it's not helping at all, really, right? So
exactly, beautifully said, John. I couldn't have said it better. And if you want to really kind of, lose sleep at night, if you want to see some of the most horrific projects, you can see the ones that are put under the banner of AI for good. That's, where people are completely convinced that they're doing something, for example, like in the forms of humanitarian aid, particularly in the global south. And in fact, what you find are these profoundly extractive projects, which are, treating the global south as a client state, where systems can be tested and experimented, but the people in these countries have no rights to say when they should be used or when not. And again, the racialized and gendered and fundamentally kind of socioeconomic dynamics that get built into these systems simply aren't questioned enough. And because they freight in a lot of those kinds of frameworks, we see consistent forms of harm. And again, so that's why we have to sort of remove this idea of like intention. The intention is to sort of do this wonderful thing. It's like, actually, no, let's prove it first. Let's see how the system works, who benefits and who pays the cost. Because time and time again, we see the same communities, the ones with the least power, the ones who are the most marginalized, are the ones who bear the greatest harms.
Jonathan.
Oh, hi. So my question builds off of this question of politics, specifically when we were in the talk and in your responses when you're discussing the relationship between AI and the prison industrial complex. I was thinking specifically with regards to the increasing push for AI development, if the reason why we don't currently have similar kinds of activist groups around AI is connected to the increasing cultural and political capital of AI, right? So if we think back to the most recent American presidential election, AI was a consistent topic across all candidates, and in my view, they all answered incorrectly. But that is to say that, again, the political and cultural capital that organizes the focus on AI seems to hold AI center. But putting that aside, I wonder if the same could be said of academia. That is, the research projects that we're engaged in are organized by the same kinds of social and political capital that seems to structure the uses and directions of AI. All this is to say is this a both and problem of both academia and AI, that the work we're doing as academics, even the critical work we're doing as academics, seems to just continually feed the beast that is the AI industrial complex, right? Through the ways that our criticisms are co-opted or otherwise marginalized, or through the ways that even projects like AI for Good sneak the ideologies back in there.
Great question. And I'm sort of taking just pages and pages of notes here of deep agreement. So two really important things that you've raised there. One is this sort of increasing sort of political and social capital of technology companies in policymaking and in DC in particular. And one way you can trace that in terms of sort of an evidentiary path is looking at the amount of lobbying money that is spent by tech companies in DC. And I believe that they're now, I think, close to being number one in terms of, you know, the amount of just raw dollars that are sort of being pumped into the sort of political system. So the power of these actors to shape policy and regulation, or the lack thereof, has never been stronger. And right now I'm dialing in and joining you from Australia, where just recently in the process of negotiation with the Australian government over regulation of Facebook and Google, Facebook decided as a sort of negotiating tactic to switch off newsfeed to an entire country. So everybody just lost a newsfeed. It wasn't just news, of course, it was all forms of organizations that were sending useful information, including everything from sort of sexual assault information to information about the upcoming vaccine program that was, of course, launching in the same week. That just switched off. And at the same time, Australian media producers who are sort of creating the news could no longer sort of share that with the world. This was a profound standover tactic, real gangster material by Facebook, and something that was so shocking. And when you have an entire country just going, what? You're just going to switch that off. And what I find that's so interesting in that is exactly what you're saying, is the way in which we've seen this type of political capital invested in privately owned networks that have spent a lot of money convincing us that these are civic infrastructures, that these are truly infrastructures for us, you know, for student activist groups to share information, for soccer clubs to say when their next gathering is, for people to talk to friends and family, and that's just there as social infrastructure. It's not. And it was a profound breach in the wall, just to see not just how much this is indeed just privately owned infrastructure that can be switched off in a minute, but that it will be switched off in the process of political negotiations that they don't like. And that sent a message, and it was designed to send a message worldwide to so many of the other countries that are right now trying to come up with regulatory mechanisms for big tech. So that is one of the gigantic problems that we're facing right now, is that we know we need regulation, but look at what happens when governments try to regulate. That was a very profound moment. Your second question is also spot on, is the relationship of universities here and this sort of university industry complex that we now see. And this is another big issue. I mean, everybody on this call has no doubt seen what's been happening in the university sector, which is that so many academics have been hired out of that sector and into industry with, honestly, the offer of just basketball level salaries. I mean, just like huge amounts of money that's being given to sort of pull people out of that sector and into industry. And it's worked. I mean, you've seen this sort of stripping of talent out of universities when I think we need it most. But at the same time, universities have been complicit in making these systems that I think have, produced harm over decades. And we're only going to change that, I think, when we start to break down some of the silos that we've seen in computer science and engineering that have separated the social sciences and the critical humanities away, these disciplines which are trained in thinking about social, political, ecological implications, that are trained in things like ethics review and IRB, things that were never part of the history of computer science because it wasn't seen as a discipline that had imminent kind of social impacts. And it didn't really, if you look back in the 1970s and 80s, it took a long time for this sort of force multiplication that we see now with AI across billions of people. So that's why we urgently need, I think, a rethinking of the pedagogy behind machine learning so that we include these social, political, and ecological questions. Yeah, but there's so much in your question. We could talk about that for an hour in itself. It's a fantastic one.
Thank you, Jonathan Flowers. Jonathan is actually our resident philosopher at the Salon. He's like a regular who's a philosopher. Max said you had the next highly voted question. Please go ahead.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for an absolutely wonderful talk. It was compelling, as always at the Learning Salon. My brain hurts in the best way possible. I'm aware that we're close to your time, and I think the question's largely been answered in the conversations you had with Jova and Ida. So I mean, if you've got time, feel free to answer. But I'm not. It's not the end of the world if you can't. It was just around. If we assume that computational systems as a whole will have some sort of cost, and that's across all the metrics that you've talked about, not just the financial ones. At what point could we reduce those costs to the point where they're outweighed by the value that can be brought in terms of healthcare innovations and communicating with people across the world like we're doing at the moment? At what point could we reduce that cost? And it's probably a much longer answer, but how can we bring about that social and political and societal change needed to bring down that cost?
So I love this question, and we've got a little bit of feedback, and I don't know if that's me, but hopefully it sounds okay to you. I'm going to take the slightly tricky path of asking you that question, because I'm really curious how you would try and answer that. Like, what would it take to start to shift those underlying dynamics?
I think it's really interesting, and it brings back the point that Ida made earlier, which I thought was fantastic, around the idea that we've had this childlike curiosity and want to create and want to do different things and want to build these models that are going to help, but then we have this underlying guilt that it's the point that someone made about Bitcoin creating so much additional energy usage. And this is why I think that it has to be a solution that's not necessarily in the hands of the individual, and it has to be a collective solution that's driven from the top. So the question then would be, how do we get people in positions of power that can start to affect that change, or even start to think about changes that are more than a 5-year election cycle in democracies? Because fundamentally, this is a problem that's not going to be answered in the next 5 years. So I think that then the question is, how do we fundamentally change every political system that currently operates in every country? So the short answer is without significant hand waving based on little to no empirical evidence, I have absolutely no idea.
I mean, look, before we kind of feel too politically disempowered by that, I want to think about, the things we have talked about today that could actually be done materially within a 5-year span. I mean, so much of the sorts of techniques that I write about in Atlas of AI have really only been mainstreamed in the last 5 years. And actually, if you think about the amount of money and power in the tech industry right now, if the people running those companies change their thinking even sort of 10-20%, the difference that could have is real too. So partly I think this is a governmental question. It has to be. It is fundamentally democratic in origin, but certainly we are looking at techniques that are absolutely perilous in the way they're constructed, and unnecessarily so. There's just so much waste and so much by way of simply not thinking about the implications of these systems. And I love that also in the comments, we have recommendations to read Ruha Benjamin, which I would +1 strongly in terms of thinking about the way in which power is being centralized by these systems, and what are sort of counter approaches, counter narratives, and questions around is this essential and is this the right way to do things? So much of that sort of critical questioning could happen in how we design systems. And frankly, I think it's going to be essential if we are going to address these core problematics.
Can I just piggyback on that just while Maxted's in the room? I mean, do you think the big companies, as sort of awful as they still are in many ways, you know, for example, Tim Cook recently gave an interview where he sort of dissed Facebook with the new privacy laws, and not laws, but the new privacy stipulations they're going to have. Do you think that they're beginning to be aware of how they're seen, and that they're beginning to sort of reconfigure themselves and distance themselves, you know, from Facebook in particular? Is that the beginning of a little bit of a panic on the part of these companies, that they have to listen to these grassroots mechanisms that you're discussing?
You know, that's hard to say. And I think you'd have to say it would depend on the company and depend on the people. And I almost don't want us to have to rely on them panicking. I think I would like us to have more rigorous methods and greater forms of accountability than just hoping that, you know, Mark wakes up one day and says, oh no, I actually care about these questions. You know, that's just far too much power to have in the hands of too few people. Certainly one of the things that I'll end on, because I know our time is short, is something that's worth everyone having a look at is a leaked document that just came out this week of the EU AI regulations. Now, obviously, these are sort of the leaked drafts, so we're not going to see the final for a couple of weeks. But even just in perusing that draft, what you'll see is a pretty profound set of suggested changes, some of which are so wide-ranging, I'm not even sure how they'd be implemented, but that's a topic for another Salon. But what we are starting to see is certainly parts of the world, Europe in particular, thinking really hard about how to regulate these forms of power and to produce change regardless of whether the people at the top of tech companies are going to decide to be beneficent or not. And frankly, why would we want a system that relies on the beneficent of the ultra rich and powerful? You know, that's not the kind of political system that I think any of us want. And certainly by looking at documents like this new regulation system, you can see the attempt to try and reset those profound asymmetries of power that the last decade have brought.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think there is a precedent, though, John. I mean, if you look at Microsoft, 20 years ago, Microsoft was the bad guy, right? They were a monopoly, and they were one of the most hated tech companies. And they changed. They took that to heart, and while they're now one of the top 5 biggest companies in the world, when you read the news about how tech companies are bad, you see Facebook, Amazon, Google, and you don't see Microsoft nearly as much.
But I mean, for me, this isn't a story of why Microsoft is better. It's really not. I mean, these companies share a set of ideological approaches and technical approaches, which mean that, you know, I think that they're all going to have to face these issues. There's no kind of, you know, best player in these sorts of stories that I've been researching anyhow. But you're absolutely right that the sort of public perception shifts with the years. And a lot of that is because of, you know, huge amount of sort of marketing and advertising machinery, and also, you know, which systems are producing the most obvious sort of immediate harms. Like if you get a Cambridge Analytica and everyone's like, okay, Facebook is the problem. But there are so many things happening under the hood that we don't see. And that's kind of what I'm trying to point to in this book, is that, you know, there's a deeper set of dynamics that we've locked ourselves into, that if we don't change, we're going to have a much deeper, much more toxic legacy than even what we've seen with the kind of the big social media platforms.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to say Facebook was a great actor, just that there's an initiative, there's a precedent for public outcry making companies change their practices. And I hope that will happen again now. I think not so much. Maybe it didn't work as well as we'd hoped, but.
I mean, the PR is a very big component there. There's something could change-ish, but they will make a huge deal out of some part of it. And it's a very good distraction tactic, right? Distraction tactics have always been very helpful. Like, look what a huge change I made to this thing that's kind of related, but addresses maybe at best 3 to 5% of the thing that you asked for, but be happy, your voice mattered, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's like sorry, I don't want this to be the closing statement for so, Kate, I understand that your time is short, so I'm going to stop and let you have the final kind of closing statement that you want to have. And after Kate leaves, guys, please don't leave. We want to show you something that I almost got RSI for.
But wait, there's more. Well, thank you, Ida. Thank you, everyone. It is such an honor just to be here at the Learning Salon. I'm just loving all the comments. I've just been sitting here going, yes, that. Let's talk about that too. So obviously there's just so much more to talk about. So I'm going to take you up, John and Ida, when we have a conversation in New York, and perhaps we'll broadcast that too. And everyone invited.
Yes.
We'll have drinks together, hopefully in real spaces at one time, if vaccines willing. So yeah, look, just to say that it's just been so fantastic to join this community, and to please keep doing what you're doing, because it's been such an important point of contact for people in really different disciplines, I think, to struggle with exactly these sorts of questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.
Take care. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Yeah, it's a very start of the day here. Yeah. I can tell you, I'm in the future, and it's looking good. So you're almost there. It's looking good.
We'll be there soon.
We'll be there soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. All right. Thank you, Maxted, also. Okay, everyone, we have one announcement. And because I have some issues with sharing my screen, Jovo will share this thing that I almost got an RSI for using the mouse so much. It's not that big of a, it's not a future announcement. It's more of a past announcement. So
It's totally worth it, though.
I mean, I spent so much time on it. I feel like the world is
Everyone should see it and eat it.
So a couple of days ago, it was John's birthday. Happy birthday, John. Of course, you don't look a day over 30, but I made this to celebrate John. And if I was good at mural painting, I would have painted this on some wall in Brooklyn. Sadly, I'm not that good. So yeah, happy birthday, John. We are very happy that you're a part of our life. We celebrate your presence, and I frankly could not have imagined the pandemic without your friendship. So I'm very happy that Jovo helped to print this on a cake and send it to your door. That was I wish that we could have like a video of you eating the cake.
No, I first of all, honestly, Ida and Jovo, I mean, finding this bomb-sized package outside my door, I'm wondering what it was, and then having me on a unicorn staring up at me, it was. I'm very touched. It's been a difficult time down here, and this made my day. And I did start eating too much of it from the sides. I couldn't bring myself to impinge upon this, but it's delicious. It's a moist velvet cake, and it was delicious.
I'm just so
thank
glad
you.
the rats didn't eat it before you got there.
And also, yes, I mean, it's lovely to see everyone in the chat. It's lovely to have had this. It's a community, and we need to keep going.
Yeah, you guys have really, everybody who's present, especially the regular participants, your questions, it has really made this feel like a community. And I, for one, I have kind of felt the sense of community. And I really think that this pandemic would have been a lot harder and unbearable without this community. So I really want to thank everyone who shows up and who asks questions.
Did you see what they're saying? Brad says he has a keyboard that can be heard from neighboring states.
You do have a keyboard that can be heard from neighboring states.
Oh my God! I feel so unconscious about that.
You also have the coolest salons. You also have the coolest headphones in the salon. Sorry, it's just Friday night. I'm like beginning to just fade out myself. This could be a lot of money as NFT. Come on, Melanie. We just heard that we have to because they destroy solar energy. So,
but I do like the idea of it being a T-shirt.
I love the idea of it being a T-shirt. I think we can wear matching T-shirts with John on a unicorn.
All of our guests will send them a big picture of John's face on a unicorn.
Well, you can see, actually, there's this wonderful YouTube series called Planet Unicorn, if you never saw it.
No.
It's a wonderful, wonderful queer animation called Planet Unicorn on YouTube. And it's 3 unicorns, which...
Is it Charlie?
Yeah, no,
Not Charlie.
you have to see. It's wonderful.
Okay.
But anyway, well, we went from unbelievable, politically powerful conversation to me on a unicorn.
Yes, we have to celebrate. A very important part of every political resistance is celebrating people who support it.
It's just a normal day for me. I talk about completely crazy nonsense with people and then hold my baby and a unicorn.
I don't know what the nonsense was, but
The stuff I say is just nonsense stuff, yes.
No, you definitely said cool stuff today. Wow, look at John doing a party trick.
Oh. Okay, I'm going. Thank you guys. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Eva, for saving us with noticing some inconsistencies in links. And thank you, Brad, and thank you, Kanaka, and thank you for everyone. And thank you, John, for having your birthday and being another round around the sun with us.
All right. Thank you, Ida. Thanks, Jovo. Ciao, guys.
Have a nice weekend.
Great weekend.
Bye.
Bye.